I just gotten home from my shift at the hospital exhausted and dreaming of a hot shower in my comfortable bed when I found three large men in expensive suits standing outside my apartment door. They were holding moving boxes and looking at their phones like they were confirming an address. "Excuse me," I said, keys in hand, trying to figure out why these intimidating strangers were blocking my door. "Can I help you?" The tallest one, built like a tank, with a scar across his cheek, looked at me with cool assessment. "You live here, apartment 4B, yes, and you're blocking my door, so if you could move, we're moving someone in. Tenant has a lease starting today." He let out his phone, showed me a document that did indeed show apartment 4B lease beginning today's date. "That's impossible. I have a lease. This is my apartment. There must be a mistake." "No mistake. We've verified the address 3 times." He gestured to the door. "You're going to need to let us in so we can start moving boxes. I'm not letting strange men into my apartment based on a document on a phone. I need to call my landlord and figure out what's happening." Before I could pull out my phone, another man appeared at the top of the stairs. Unlike the others, he wasn't carrying boxes. He was just there and impossible to ignore. He was probably early 30s, tall and powerfully built, with dark hair and sharp features that were striking in an almost unsettling way. He wore a perfectly tailored suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, and he moved with the kind of confidence that suggested he was used to getting exactly what he wanted. "Problem?" he asked, his voice deep and carrying a slight accent. "I couldn't place this woman. Says she lives here." Scarface explained, "Claims there's been a mistake." The man in the expensive suit turned his attention to me, dark eyes assessing. "You're Elena Martinez." "Elena Martinez, not Martinez. And yes, I live here, have lived here for 2 years. So whoever you are, you have the wrong apartment. I'm Dante Romano, and I have a lease for apartment 4B signed by the building's owner starting today. If you also have a lease, then someone made an error. But that's not my problem. It's yours and the landlord's to sort out. You can't just move into an occupied apartment because you have a piece of paper. Actually, legally, I can. The lease is valid. You'll need to take up the double booking with your landlord." He nodded to his men. "Start moving boxes, and we're on a schedule." "No, you're not moving anything into my apartment." I positioned myself in front of the door, which was admittedly stupid given that these men could easily move me acid. But I was exhausted, angry, and not thinking clearly. Dante studied me for a long moment, then sighed. "Lorenzo, call the landlord. Get them on speakerphone. We'll sort this out now rather than waste time arguing." While one of his men made the call, I took the opportunity to really look at Dante Romano. He was attractive in a dangerous way, the kind of man who probably had women falling at his feet, but also probably had a dozen reasons you should run in the opposite direction. The expensive suit, the armed guards, the casual assumption that he could just move into an occupied apartment. Everything screamed money and power and trouble. "Mr. Kim, it's Lorenzo C.A. Ling on behalf of Mr. Romano regarding apartment 4B. The scarred man said into his phone, "There's a tenant here claiming the apartment is hers." "Yes, I'll put you on speaker." My landlord's voice came through, tiny but clear. "Elena, is that you?" "Mr. Kim, what's going on? Why are there men trying to move into my apartment?" "Oh, Elena, I tried to call you earlier, but it went to voicemail. There's been a situation. The building has been sold. New owner wanted to make some changes, including restructuring some of the leases. Your apartment was one that got reassigned." "What does that mean?" "You can't just kick me out." "I'm not kicking you out. Your lease is still valid, but the apartment number has changed. You're now in 4C instead of 4B. 4C, that's the studio apartment." "Mr. Kim, I have a 1-bedroom. All my furniture, my life, everything is set up for a 1-bedroom. You can't just move me to a studio." "The new lease terms include a rent reduction to compensate for the smaller space. You'll be paying $400 less per month." "I don't want to pay less for a smaller apartment. I want to keep my apartment that I've been living in for 2 years." "I'm sorry, Elena. The building's sale and new lease terms were final as of last week. I sent you an email about it." I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my emails. There it was, buried in my spam folder. Sent a week ago, an email explaining the building sale, new management, lease restructuring. I'd never seen it because I've been working 60-hour weeks and hadn't checked my spam in days. "This isn't fair. I never agreed to this. Your original lease had a clause about changes due to building ownership transfer." "I know this is inconvenient, but legally everything is in order." "Mr. Romano's lease for 4B is valid. Your lease for 4C is valid. I've already had maintenance move your things to the new apartment. You moved my stuff without my permission. I tried to call you 3 times this morning. Like I said, it went to voicemail." Mr. Kim sounded tired and defensive. "Look, I'm sorry this is happening, but my hands are tied. New ownership, new rules. You can accept the new apartment with reduced rent, or you can break your lease and find somewhere else. Those are your options. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw my phone at the wall. Instead, I just closed my eyes and tried to breathe. Fine, I'll take 4C. But Mr. Kim, this is absolutely unacceptable. We're going to have a serious conversation about tenant rights and proper. Notice I understand you're upset. We can discuss this later. For now, your new keys are on the kitchen counter in 4C. He hung up. I turned to Dante Romano, who'd been watching this entire exchange with an espresso. And that was either amusement or pity. I couldn't tell which. Congratulations, you got my apartment. I hope you're happy. I didn't get your apartment. I signed a lease for an available unit. If your landlord mishandled the situation, that's between you and him. I'm just moving into the apartment I legally rented with armed guards and moving teams like you're some kind of. I stopped, really looking at the men surrounding him. Professional alert. Constantly scanning the surroundings. Who are you? What kind of person needs security like this just to move into an apartment? Someone who values safety and privacy. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have moving to do, I'm sure. You want to check out your new apartment and make sure your belongings are intact. He was dismissing me like I was an inconvenience he'd already dealt with and could now ignore. The arrogance made my anger flare even hotter. 4C is a studio. It's half the size of this apartment. If my things don't fit, if anything is damaged, because your lease forced me into a smaller space, then you'll take it up with the landlord who's responsible for the move. Not with me. I'm simply the new tenant of 4B. He nodded to his men. Let's get started. I want to be settled by tonight. They moved past me like I wasn't even there, carrying boxes into what used to be my apartment. I stood in the hallway feeling violated and helpless, watching strangers invade my space. The apartment next door, 4C, had its door propped open. I walked in to find my furniture crammed into a space that was clearly too small. My bed took up most of the main room. My couch was pushed against one wall, my desk against another, barely leaving walking space. Boxes were stacked everywhere. I spent the next hour trying to make the studio apartment functional, but it was hopeless. My things simply didn't fit. The space felt claustrophobic, cramped like a college dorm room. I was 26 years old, a registered nurse with a demanding job, and I was being forced to live like a student because some rich guy with bodyguards decided he wanted my apartment. Drug dealer, my coworker Sarah, suggested during our lunch break. I told her about the apartment situation, though I'd left out the part about Dante being disturbingly attractive. Rich guy, security guards, irregular hours. That screams illegal activity. Or he's just a businessman who travels a lot with armed guards. Girl, that's not normal businessman behavior. You should be careful. Maybe get a better lock on your door. She had a point. There was definitely something unusual about Dante Romano, but I had bigger problems than figuring out my mysterious neighbor's profession. Like the fact that my student loans were due, my car needed repairs I couldn't afford, and I had just gotten a notice that my health insurance premiums were going up 2 weeks after Dante moved in. I came home at 11 p.m. after a brutally long shift to find my key wouldn't work in the lock. I tried 3 times before accepting that something was wrong. Exhausted and on the verge of tears, I knocked on 4B. After a minute, Dante answered, looking like he'd been working. Dress shirt partially unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up, hair slightly messed up in a way that should have looked disheveled, but instead looked unfairly attractive. Elena, everything okay? My key won't work. I think the lock is broken or something. Do you have Mr. Kim's emergency number? I can't find it in my phone. It's almost midnight. Calling now probably won't get you anywhere. Maintenance won't come until morning. He stepped back from his door. You're welcome to wait in here until you figure something out. I was working anyway, so I'm awake. I should have said no, should have gone back downstairs and called Mr. Kim anyway, or found a hotel, or literally anything other than accepting help from the man who had taken my apartment. But I was exhausted, my feet hurt, and the thought of dealing with this crisis right now was overwhelming. Thank you, I appreciate. 8 at the apartment. My former apartment looked completely different. He'd furnished it with expensive minimalist furniture, large windows I'd never properly appreciated, now showcased a stunning view of the city at night. Everything was clean, organized, clearly decorated by someone with both money and taste. You've done a lot with the place, I said, trying not to feel bitter about how much better it looked than when I'd lived here. I like having a comfortable home base when I'm in the city. Coffee, you look like you could use it, please. It's been a horrible shift. 3 traumas, 2 codes, and a patient's family member who threatened to sue me personally because we couldn't save their father who came in already deceased. Dante made coffee in an expensive espresso machine that definitely hadn't been in this apartment when I lived here. Sounds rough. How long Have you been a nurse 4 years? Sometimes it feels like 4 decades. I accepted the coffee gratefully. What do you do for work? I mean, Sarah thinks you're a drug dealer. Because of the security and irregular hours, he smiled slightly, something that transformed his usually serious face. Not a drug dealer. I run operations for my family's business, import-export, primarily based in Italy, but with significant work in New York. That's vague enough to be yes. Auspicious. It's vague because the details are boring: shipping manifests, customs paperwork, supply chain logistics. Not exactly cocktail party conversation, but interesting enough to need armed security. My family is wealthy and well-known in certain circles. Security is a precaution, not a necessity. But after a kidnapping attempt on my cousin 3 years ago, we don't take chances. That sounded plausible. Rich families did have security for legitimate reasons. Maybe Sarah was wrong and Dante was just a businessman with reasonable precautions. We talked for the next hour about work, about the city, about the building and its quirks. He was surprisingly easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor that made me laugh despite my exhaustion. And when I checked my phone and realized it was past 1 a.m., I was surprised by how quickly the time had passed. I should try my door again. Maybe the lock was just stuck, or I could call a locksmith now, have them come out first thing in the morning, get you a working lock by 8 a.m. That would be expensive. Emergency locksmith calls are ridiculous. Consider it a neighborly favor, compensation for taking your apartment. If you want to think of it that way, you didn't take my apartment, you rented an available unit. I'm angry at the wrong person. I repeated his words from our first meeting. But if you're offering to pay for a locksmith, I won't say no. It's been a really bad week. He made a call in Italian, speaking rapidly to whoever was on the other end. After hanging up, he turned back to me. Locksmith will be here at 7 a.m. In the meantime, you can stay in the guest room if you want to sleep, or take the couch if you prefer to be in the common area. Your choice. Dante: I can't, that's too much. It's a guest room that's sitting empty. You're exhausted from a 12-hour shift and dealing with a lock crisis. Just accept the help. Elena, not everything has to be a fight. He was right. I was too tired to fight or to figure out alternatives. Okay. Thank you. I'll take the couch, though the guest room feels like too much. Suit yourself. Blankets and pillows are in the hall closet. Help yourself to anything in the kitchen if you get hungry. He started toward what I assumed was his bedroom, then paused. And Elena, I really am sorry about the apartment situation. I know I was just renting an available unit. Doesn't make it less frustrating for you, but for what it's worth, you're handling it better than most people would. After he disappeared into his room, I sat on the couch processing the evening, the conversation, the unexpected kindness from someone I'd been prepared to hate indefinitely. Dante Romano W. As not what I'd expected. He was polite, thoughtful, funny in a quiet way, and apparently wealthy enough to casually pay for emergency locksmith services without thinking twice about the cost. He was also clearly involved in something that required armed security, which should have been a red flag. But sitting in his apartment, drinking excellent coffee, and feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks, I found it hard to care much about red flags. The locksmith arrived promptly at 7 a.m. and had my lock working within minutes. Dante emerged from his room as the locksmith was finishing, dressed for what looked like a business meeting in another perfectly tailored suit. Everything working properly now? The locksmith asked in accented English, testing the lock mechanism one more time. Yes, it's perfect, thank you, Elena said, relief clear in her voice. Dante handed the man cash, covering the bill plus what looked like a generous tip. Grazie, Lorenzo, Dante said in what sounded like fluent Italian. Prego, the locksmith replied. Then to Elena, Signorina, your lock should work perfectly now. If you have more problems, call this number. He handed her a card after the locksmith left. Elena turned to Dante, who was checking his phone and gathering papers into a briefcase. Thank you again. I really appreciate this. You saved me from what would have been a miserable night of sleeping in a hotel or on the floor. Don't mention it. Neighbors should look out for each other, especially when the building management is less than ideal. I should get going. Business calls. But Elena, if you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask. I'm gone quite a bit, but when I'm here, I'm happy to help. She watched him leave, still processing this unexpected turn of events. Yesterday, Dante Romano had been the arrogant stranger who'd stolen her apartment. Today, he was the neighbor who'd helped her through a crisis without expecting anything in return. Sarah was going to have opinions about this development. The next few weeks fell into an easy routine. Elena would come home from her shifts at the hospital, often finding Dante either leaving for or returning from business meetings. Their paths crossed regularly in the hallway or at the building's mailboxes, and their interactions were consistently pleasant. He always asked about her day, seemed genuinely interested in her work, and never failed to offer help if she looked overwhelmed. He's not a drug dealer, Elena told Sarah after 3 weeks of these interactions. He's just a businessman with family money and security concerns. That's what he tells you, Sarah replied skeptically. But Elena, people in legitimate business don't need armed guards to move into apartments. Normal rich people hire moving companies, not security teams. You're being naive, maybe. But if he was dangerous, wouldn't I know by now? Wouldn't there be signs? We talk regularly. He's never been anything but respectful and helpful. He fixed my garbage disposal last week when it was broken. Does that sound like criminal behavior? That sounds like someone trying to get close to you for reasons you haven't figured out yet. Just be careful, Elena. I don't want you getting involved in something dangerous. Sarah's warnings might have carried more weight if Elena hadn't spent the past month watching Dan T's daily routine. He left early most mornings, dressed for business, returned by evening, sometimes looking tired, but never injured or suspicious. His apartment was quiet except for occasional phone calls in Italian. And while he clearly had money, his lifestyle seemed more like a successful businessman than a criminal. He was also surprisingly domestic, cooking elaborate meals that filled the hallway with amazing smells, maintaining a spotless apartment, and tending to a small herb garden on the fire escape that he'd somehow managed to cultivate despite their urban location. You cook, Elena observed one evening when the smell of garlic and something it might have been pancetta wafted from his apartment as she was unlocking her door. Family requirement, Dante replied, appearing in his doorway with a dish towel over his shoulder. My mother insisted all her sons learn to cook properly. Said she wouldn't have us embarrassing the family by being helpless in the kitchen. It smells incredible. Whatever you're making, osso buco, been simmering all day. He paused, then seemed to make a decision. Have you eaten dinner yet? Not yet. I was going to heat up leftover takeout. Join me. There's way too much food for one person, and it's better with company. Elena hesitated. Accepting help with a locksmith was one thing, but dinner felt more personal, more like the beginning of whatever Sarah was warning her about. On the other hand, the smell was incredible. She hadn't had a proper home-cooked meal in months, and Dante was right. The portions he cooked did seem excessive for one person. Okay, but only if you're sure you don't mind the company. I never mind good company. He stepped aside to let her into the apartment she'd lived in for 2 years, but which now felt completely foreign. The dining table was set for two, as if he'd been planning to ask her before he'd actually done it. Wine was breathing on the counter, and soft jazz was playing from hidden speakers. The whole scene was either very presumptuous or very hopeful. You were planning this, she accused, but without any real annoyance. Hoping for it, Dante corrected with a smile that was almost shy. I've been wanting an excuse to cook for someone other than myself, and you've seemed stressed lately. Thought you might appreciate a real meal. He wasn't wrong. She had been stressed. Work was demanding. Her finances were tight, and living in a cramped studio apartment wasn't helping her mental state. But sharing dinner with her mysterious neighbor felt like crossing a line from polite neighborly interaction into something more complicated and potentially dangerous. Except and he handed her a glass of wine and started explaining the process of braising veal shanks with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved cooking. The danger felt abstract, and the warmth felt immediate. Dinner was extraordinary, not just the food, which was restaurant quality, but the conversation. Dante was well-traveled, articulate, and surprisingly funny in a dry, understated way. He asked thoughtful questions about her work, listened to her stories about difficult patients and hospital politics, and shared his own experiences with family business dynamics that sounded complicated in ways he didn't fully explain. You have siblings? Elena asked as finished the main course. 3 brothers. I'm the second oldest, the responsible one, according to my mother, the one who's supposed to keep everyone in line and out of trouble. That sounds like a lot of pressure. It can be. Family businesses are complicated, especially when the business has been in the family for generations. Everyone has opinions about how things should run. Everyone thinks they know better than everyone else, and you're stuck in the middle trying to keep the peace while actually getting work done. Exactly. He refilled her wine glass. You understand that dynamic. Your family runs a business too. Not exactly. My father was a mechanic, owned his own shop, but it was just him and maybe one employee at a time. Nothing like a multi-generational operation with complex family politics. Then you understand the pressure of being responsible for other people's livelihoods, just in a different way. Elena nodded. She did understand that her father had worked himself into an early grave, trying to keep his shop afloat, support his family, and maintain his reputation as the most reliable mechanic in their neighborhood. The weight of other people Depending on you was something she recognized. Even if the scale was different, we stayed at the table talking until nearly midnight, covering everything from travel to books to the complexities of working in fields where people's lives or livelihoods depended on your competence. Dante was an excellent listener, asking follow-up questions that showed he was genuinely engaged, drawing out stories and opinions Elena hadn't shared with anyone in months. There was something about his attention that made her feel heard in a way she'd forgotten was possible. "This has been really nice," Elena said as she finally prepared to leave, "but I should go early shift tomorrow, and you probably have business things to deal with." "I do, but this was the best evening I've had in a long time, Elena. Thank you for joining me." "Thank you for cooking and for the company." It beat leftover Chinese food and Netflix by a considerable margin. "Anytime you want a break from takeout, let me know. I enjoy cooking for appreciative audiences." After Elena returned to her apartment, she tried to process what had just happened. Dinner with Dante had felt natural, comfortable, like spending time with an old friend rather than a near stranger. She'd found herself laughing more than she had in weeks, relaxing in a way that felt almost foreign after months of stress. He was charming, certainly, but not in a manipulative way, more like someone who was genuinely interested in other people and skilled at making them feel comfortable. It should have felt suspicious, the perfectly timed invitation, the elaborate meal, the obvious expense and effort involved. But instead it had felt like the nicest thing that had happened to her in a very long time. Sarah was going to have so many opinions about this development over the next month. Dinner became a semi-regular occurrence, never planned, always spontaneous, usually triggered by the smell of something delicious coming from Dante's apartment and his invitation to join him. Elena began to look forward to these evenings. They provided a break from her stressful work routine, a chance to eat food that wasn't reheated or delivered, and conversation with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and experiences. Dante was an excellent cook, with an apparently endless repertoire of Italian dishes. He was also surprisingly domestic, maintaining his apartment with a level of cleanliness and organization that Elena envied, and somehow managing to have fresh flowers on his table every week despite his irregular schedule. "He's courting you," Sarah announced after Elena described their latest dinner, which had featured homemade pasta and a wine that probably cost more than Elena's weekly grocery budget. "You realize that, right? This isn't just neighborly friend. Linus, this is a full-scale charm offensive. We're friends. I enjoy his company, and he's a good cook. That doesn't mean he's courting me." "Elena, honey, men don't cook osso buco for women they're not interested in, and they definitely don't do it regularly. You're being deliberately naive because you like the attention and the food, but you need to be realistic about what this is." Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe Elena was being naive, but if Dante was interested in her romantically, he was being remarkably subtle about it. Their conversations were easy and wide-ranging, but never crossed into obviously flirtatious territory. He was attentive and thoughtful, but in a way that felt respectful rather than predatory. If this was courtship, it was unlike any Elena had experienced before, which, given her track record with men, might not be a bad thing. Her last serious relationship had ended 6 months ago, when her ex-boyfriend decided that her work schedule was too demanding and her career ambitions too intense for his taste. He'd wanted someone who would be more available, more focused on his needs, and less distracted by what he called her obsession with other people's problems. The breakup had been painful, but also clarifying. Elena loved her work, was good at it, and wasn't willing to compromise her career for Omion, who couldn't understand that Dante, by contrast, seemed to respect her dedication to nursing, asked intelligent questions about her work, and never made her feel guilty for the long hours or emotional demands of her job. That alone made him different from most men she'd dated. He had also never made her feel like her small apartment or her financial concerns were something to be embarrassed about when she'd apologized for not being able to reciprocate his elaborate dinners. He'd looked genuinely confused. "Money isn't the point, Elena. It's about company and conversation. I have more than I need. You have interesting stories and laugh at my jokes. That seems like a fair trade to me." It was exactly the right thing to say, delivered in a tone that made it clear he meant it. Elena found herself looking forward to seeing him in ways that probably weren't entirely platonic, which Sarah would undoubtedly point out was exactly what made the situation potentially dangerous. "He could be using your attraction to manipulate you," Sarah had warned. "People who are up to no good are often charming. That's how they get away with things." But Elena was beginning to think that if Dante was up to something, the something might just be building a genuine friendship with his neighbor, which seemed like a reasonable ing for a lonely businessman to want. Their relationship shifted subtly one evening. In early November, Elena came home to find Dante in the hallway outside his apartment, talking on the phone in rapid, angry Italian. He hung up when he saw her, but not before she caught the tone. His voice had been sharp, authoritative in a way she'd never heard before. "Everything okay?" Elena asked, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set. "Family business," Dante said, but his tone was clipped, distant. "Nothing I can't handle, you sure? Because you look pretty stressed, and if you need to talk or just need company, I'm around." He studied her for a moment, as if saying something, then his expression softened. "Thank you, that means more than you know, but this is something I need to deal with on my own. Rain, check on dinner tonight. I might be out late handling things." Elena nodded, trying not to feel hurt by the sudden distance. "Be safe, whatever it is." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I will see you tomorrow, hopefully." After Dante left, Elena found herself worrying in a way that felt disproportionate to their relationship. They were neighbors, friends, but the level of concern she felt suggested her feelings had developed beyond casual friendliness. When he still wasn't home by 2 a.m., she found herself checking the window every few minutes, listening for footsteps in the hallway. Sarah would say she was getting too emotionally invested in someone she barely knew, and Sarah would probably be right, but knowing that didn't make the worry go away. Dante returned the next evening looking exhausted, but unharmed. Elena encountered him in the lobby as she was coming home from work. "How did things go?" she asked, trying to sound casual rather than like she'd been worried about him for 24 hours. "Handled," he said simply, then seemed to realize how abrupt that sounded. "Sorry, I don't mean to be mysterious. It's just family business can be complicated, and I try to keep work problems separate from personal life." "That makes sense. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. You seemed really stressed last night." "I was, but it's resolved now." He paused, then seemed to make a decision. "Have you eaten dinner yet?" "I was thinking of making something simple, comfort food, after the last few days." "Not yet." "And comfort food sounds perfect. Actually, it's been a long week." He smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him since the phone call. "Good, I could use the company and a distraction from thinking about work over pasta and wine." Dante seemed to relax back into the easy companionship they developed. His mood lightened, and by the end of the evening, he was laughing at Elena's stories about her more eccentric patients and sharing his own tales of family members who couldn't agree on anything, but somehow managed to run a successful business together. The stressful phone call and mysterious absence weren't mentioned again, but Elena noticed he kept his phone on silent during dinner and ignored several incoming calls. It felt like a deliberate choice to prioritize their time together, which was both flattering and slightly concerning. The pattern repeated itself several times over the next few weeks. Dante would receive calls that clearly upset or stressed him. He'd become distant and distracted, sometimes disappearing for a day or two, then return looking tired but relieved and ready to resume their friendship as if nothing had happened. Elena began to recognize the signs, the tension in his posture. When certain calls came in, the way he'd switch to Italian, when he didn't want to be overheard, the careful way he'd deflect questions about where he'd been or what he'd been dealing with. It should have been a red flag, should have made her more cautious. Instead, it made her want to help or at least offer support in whatever way he'd accept. "You don't have to handle everything alone," Elena said one evening after Dante had spent most of dinner distracted by work calls he'd been ignoring. "I mean, I know we haven't known each other that long, but if you need someone to talk to or just someone to sit with you while you deal with stressful things, I'm good at that." Dante looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression from surprise to what might have been gratitude. "Why would you offer that? You barely know me. We're friends and friends support each other. That's how friendship works." Elena said simply, "You've been incredibly kind to me since this whole apartment situation happened. You've fed me, listened to my work problems, helped with practical things. Let me return the favor if I can." "I appreciate that more than you know," Dante said quietly, "but my work problems aren't the kind most people can help with. They're complicated and sometimes dangerous." Elena felt a chill, but kept her expression neutral. "Because you're in import-export, the shipping business can be dangerous," Dante said carefully. "Territorial disputes with competitors, regulatory issues, things that require delicate handling. Sometimes physical handling." Elena processed this his irregular hours, the security, the phone calls that made him angry or stressed, the way he deflected questions about his work. It painted a picture that was becoming difficult To ignore what kind of import-export business requires physical handling of territorial disputes with competitors, the kind where the competition doesn't always respect legal boundaries or proper procedures. Dante's voice was quiet, measured, where sometimes disagreements escalate beyond what they should and family businesses have to protect their interests and their people. Elena felt like they were having two conversations, the surface one about legitimate business challenges and the underlying one about something much more serious and possibly illegal. She also felt like Dante was giving her an opportunity to ask direct questions or to step back from whatever this was becoming. Instead of asking direct questions, she made a choice based on what she'd learned about Dante over the past few months. Whatever his work involved, he'd been nothing but kind, respectful, and protective toward her. He clearly cared about his family's business and took his responsibilities seriously. And despite the obvious stress and occasional danger of his work, he made time for quiet evenings, cooking dinner and talking about books and travel and hospital stories. That made him laugh. If he was involved in something illegal, it wasn't something that made him cruel or careless with other people's safety. It wasn't something that made him treat her as anything less than an equal worthy of respect and genuine friendship. Be careful, Elena said finally. Whatever these territorial disputes involve, make sure you're being safe. I don't know what I'd do if something happened to you. The admission surprised her with its honesty, but it was true. Somewhere along the way, Dante Romano had become important to her in ways that went beyond neighborly friendliness or even casual friendship. Dante's expression softened. I'll be careful, Elena, I promise, and if things ever get too complicated or too dangerous, I'll tell you. I won't let you get caught up in something you didn't sign you. For they looked at each other across the dinner table, and Elena realized that whatever was happening between them had just shifted into something more serious than friendship. They were making promises to each other, promises that suggested a level of care and commitment that friends didn't usually negotiate. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe this was courtship disguised as neighborly kindness. Maybe Dante was being deliberately careful about revealing his feelings because his work made relationships complicated or dangerous, or maybe he was just a good man in a difficult situation who was as surprised as Elena to find himself caring about someone in ways he hadn't expected. Either way, Elena was no longer pretending that her feelings were purely platonic. The realization should have been terrifying given how little she actually knew about Dante's work or life, but sitting there looking at his dark eyes full of concern for her safety and appreciation for her friendship, it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Elena went to bed that night knowing that she was falling in love with a man who was almost certainly involved in something illegal, and discovering that she cared less about the illegal part than she would have expected. The part that mattered was how he treated her, how he made her feel, and how much she'd come to depend on his presence in her life. Everything else felt like details that could be worked out later if they both wanted to badly enough. The shift in their relationship was subtle but unmistakable. After their conversation about Dante's work, Elena found him watching her more carefully, as if assessing how much she could handle, how much she wanted to know. His touches became more frequent and deliberate, a hand on her shoulder when he passed behind her chair, fingers brushing hers when he handed her a glass of wine, standing close enough when they cooked together that she could smell his cologne. Elena responded in finding excuses to touch his arm during conversation, letting her hand linger when he helped her with her coat, standing in his personal space. When they talked in the kitchen, they were dancing around each other, testing boundaries, seeing how the other responded, and Elena discovered that she liked this careful courtship, liked the attention and consideration Dante paid to her comfort level, liked the way he seemed to genuinely care about her thoughts and feelings rather than just trying to charm his way into her bed. Not that she would have minded if he tried to charm his way into her bed. The thought of kissing Dante had occurred to her with easing frequency, and the idea of more than kissing was becoming a pleasant distraction during long shifts at the hospital. But she appreciated that he was letting her set the pace, giving her time to decide what she wanted without pressure or assumptions about where their relationship was heading. The careful progression might have continued indefinitely, if not for the night Elena came home to find 3 strangers in her apartment, 2 men and a woman, all dressed in dark clothing, searching through her belongings with professional efficiency. She backed toward the door, heart pounding, but one of the men moved to block her exit while another approached Ed with what looked like a syringe. Elena Martinez, the woman, said with a slight accent, "We need to ask you some questions about your neighbor." "I don't know anything about my neighbor." Elena managed fear making her voice shake. "I barely know him, but you've been spending time with him, eating dinner, talking, sharing personal information." The woman continued, her tone conversational, as if they weren't holding Elena prisoner in her own apartment. "He trusts you, which means you might know things we need to." "No, I really don't know anything about Dante's work or his business. I'm just a nurse. I work at the hospital. We're neighbors." That's all. The woman nodded. One of the men who stepped closer with the syringe. "This will be easier if you cooperate, Elena, but either way we're going to find out what Dante Romano has told you and what you've seen." Before Elena could respond or try to run, she heard the front door of the building crash open, followed by shouting in Italian and the sound of footsteps running up the stairs. The three intruders looked at each other, then moved quickly toward Elena's fire escape window, apparently deciding that whatever was happening downstairs was more important than continuing their interrogation. The woman paused before climbing out the window. "We'll be back, Elena, and next time we won't be interrupted. If you're smart, you'll convince your neighbor to be more cooperative with people who are trying to have reasonable business discussions with him." After they left, Elena sat on her couch, shaking, processing what had just happened. Someone had broken into her apartment looking for information about Dante. People who clearly knew who he was and what he did, and who thought Elena might have information worth extracting by force. The romantic fantasy she'd been building about mysterious neighbors and complicated business was suddenly very real and very dangerous. She should call the police, should report the break-in, and let law enforcement handle whatever this was about. But something stopped her. Maybe it was loyalty to Dante, or maybe it was the realization that involving police might make things worse for everyone involved. Instead, she locked her door, checked all her windows, and waited. Elena didn't have to wait long. 20 minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door, Lorenzo's voice identifying himself. When she looked through the peephole, she saw Lorenzo and two other men she recognized as part of Dante's security team. "Elena, it's safe to open the door. Dante sent us to check on you." She let them in, noting the way they immediately began examining her apartment, looking for signs of intrusion or danger. "Did they hurt you?" Lorenzo asked, his usual casual demeanor replaced by professional concern. "Are you injured?" "No, they didn't hurt me, just scared me," Elena said, then described the three intruders, what they'd asked, and how they'd left when they heard noise from downstairs. Lorenzo made several phone calls in rapid Italian, while his colleagues finished their security sweep, then turned back to Elena. "Pack a bag. You're not staying here tonight. This apartment isn't safe and won't be until we neutralize the people who were here." "Where am I supposed to go?" "Safe house, until we handle the situation. Don't pack too much, just initials for a few days." Elena wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could take care of herself, or that this was all an overreaction, but the memory of the woman's casual tone while discussing interrogation techniques and the man with the syringe made her compliant rather than argumentative. She threw essentials into a bag with shaking hands, trying not to think about how quickly her life had become something she didn't recognize. The safe house turned out to be a luxury apartment in a building with obvious security features. Doorman who looked like former military, multiple locks on every door, windows that didn't open wide enough for someone to climb through. Elena was given a bedroom with her own bathroom and told to make herself comfortable. Someone would bring her meals and anything else she needed, but she shouldn't leave the apartment without escort for her own safety. "How long will I be here?" she asked Lorenzo. Not knowing was almost worse than knowing it was dangerous. "Not long," Lorenzo assured her. "Dante is handling the situation personally. These people made a mistake threatening you. They don't understand who they're dealing with." That should have been reassuring. Instead, it made Elena realize how much she still didn't know about Dante Romano and exactly how much danger she'd unknowing Ly walked into. By becoming his friend alone in the safe house, Elena had time to think about everything that had led to this moment. The apartment situation that had seemed like bad luck, the way Dante had been conveniently helpful and charming, the gradual development of friendship and attraction that had felt natural and unforced. All of it could have been calculated, designed to draw her into Dante's world in a way that made her useful or vulnerable. She wanted to believe that Dante's feelings for her were genuine, that the man who cooked her dinner and listened to her work stories was the real person underneath whatever criminal persona he meant to end professionally. But sitting in a safe house after being threatened by people who thought she had information worth torturing out of her, Elena had to acknowledge that she might have been naive about the entire situation. The next evening, Dante arrived at the safe house looking exhausted but determined. He found Elena in the living room reading a book someone had thoughtfully provided, trying to distract herself from thinking about her Situation, are you all right? He asked, sitting beside her on the couch, his dark eyes scanning her face for signs of trauma or injury. I'm fine physically, Elena said, meeting his gaze directly. Scared, confused, angry. Ut not hurt. They didn't actually do anything, just threatened to do things and asked questions about you. I'm sorry, Dante said, and she could hear genuine regret in his voice. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent by keeping you separate from my work. I never wanted you to be at risk because of me. What exactly is your work? Elena asked. Because I think I deserve to know now what I've gotten myself into by being your friend. My family is involved in organized crime, Dante said without hedging or euphemism. We've been part of the Cosa Nostra for 4 generations. We run legitimate businesses, but we also control territory, manage disputes between families, and handle enforcement when other methods fail. I'm second in command under my uncle, and I'm being groomed to take over operations when he retires. The people who came to your apartment work for a rival family that's been trying to muscle in on our territory. They think you might have information about our operations, our security, our financial arrangements. Because they've seen us together, they thought threatening you would give them leverage over me. Elena absorbed this, trying to reconcile. The man who made her laugh over dinner with someone who was part of an organized crime family. They weren't wrong, were they? She asked quietly. About me, have ing information? I mean, I don't know about your operations, but I do know your routines when you're home, when you're not, how you react to certain phone calls. If someone wanted to hurt you, they could use that information. You're not responsible for any of this, Elena, Dante said firmly. You didn't know what my work involved, and I deliberately kept you ignorant to protect you from exactly this situation. The blame is entirely mine for letting you get close enough to become a target, but you did let me get close, Elena pointed out, and you didn't tell me what I was getting close to. That was my choice to make, Dante, not yours. Whether I wanted to risk being associated with someone in your line of work should have been my decision. You're right, Dante said after a moment. I should have told you sooner, should have given you the choice to walk away before you became emotionally invested, before you became a target. I was selfish. I enjoyed having someone in my life who knew me as just Dante, not as Romano family second in command, not as someone to be feared or used, but as someone who could cook dinner and have normal conversations. I didn't want to lose that. So are you planning to tell me the truth now? Elena asked, about what this actually means, what your work really involves, what being part of your life what old look like going forward. I'll tell you everything you want to know, Dante said, but first I want you to understand that you have options. This situation is my fault, and I'll fix it. The people who threatened you won't be a problem going forward. I can relocate you, set you up somewhere safe, far from my family's business, with enough money to start over anywhere you want, or you can stay and accept what my life actually is. But if you stay, you need to understand what you're choosing. Elena looked at him, this man who had somehow become central to her life in just a few months, who had been kind and thoughtful and protective, even while hiding the truth about who he really was. The smart choice was probably to take his offer to relocate, to disappear somewhere his enemies couldn't find her, and build a new life free from the complications of organized crime. But looking at Dante's dark eyes full of regret and hope, and something that looked like love, Elena realized that the smart choice wasn't necessarily the right choice for her. I want to stay, she said, but I need you to promise me complete honesty. From now on, no more mysterious phone calls, that you won't explain, no more disappearing for days without telling me what's happening. If we're going to do this, we do it with full disclosure, I can promise. That, Dante said, though you should know that complete honesty about my work means you'll learn things that might be difficult to accept. I can handle difficult, Elena said. I'm a trauma nurse. I deal with difficult every day. What I can't handle is being kept in the dark about things that affect my safety or our relationship. Fair enough, Dante smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. Then we need to talk about what staying means practically, because my life isn't like other people's lives, and if you're part of it, yours won't be either. Over the next few hours, Dante explained what being with him would actually entail, the security measures that while LD become part of her daily routine, the family members and business associates she'd need to meet, and navigate relationships with the social expectations and responsibilities that came with being the girlfriend and potentially wife of someone in his position, the legitimate business operations that provided cover and income alongside the illegal activities that provided power and protection in their world. It was overwhelming, but not as frightening as Elena had expected, maybe because Dante presented it as information rather than demands, as choices she could make rather than rules she'd have to follow, maybe because by now she trusted him enough to believe he wouldn't let anything happen to her Or maybe, because the alternative, losing him, felt worse than accepting the complications of his world. What about your family? Elena asked. How do they feel about outsiders, about Americans, about nurses from normal backgrounds? My uncle will want to meet you, assess whether you're a security risk or a potential asset, Dante said honestly. My mother will want to feed you and ask invasive questions about your intentions toward her son. My brothers will probably try to intimidate you to see if you're tough enough to handle family dynamics. And my cousins will gossip about you until something more interesting happens. That sounds terrifying, but manageable, Elena said. What about the other families, the people who threaten me? They've been dealt with, Dante said, and his tone suggested she shouldn't ask for details. But there will always be potential threats, Elena, people who might try to use you to get to me or information about family business. You'll need security training, self-defense awareness of how to recognize and respond to dangerous situations. I can arrange all of that, but it means your independence will be limited in ways you might not like. I've been thinking about that, Elena said, and I think I can handle limited independence if it means keeping both of us safe. What I need is to feel like an equal partner in this relationship, not someone you're protecting from your real life. If I'm going to be part of your world, I want to actually be part of it, not just hidden away for my own safety. That can be arranged, Dante said, though it means you'll learn things about family business that will make you legally complicit in some activities. Are you prepared for that? Elena considered this. The legal implications of knowingly associating with organized crime were serious, but so was everything else about the choice she was making. I'm prepared, she said, if you are. And that was how Elena Martinez, a nurse from Portland, decided to fall in love with Dante Romano, second in command of a New York crime family. It wasn't the story she'd expected when she'd rented apartment 4C, but it was better than anything she could have imagined, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. Over the following weeks, Elena was introduced to Dante's world in carefully managed stages. First, family dinner at his uncle's estate, where she met the older generation who ran the family's operations and discovered that Dante's mother was exactly as he described, warm, overwhelming, and determined to extract Elena's entire life story over multiple courses of incredible food. In business meetings, where she observed how Dante handled negotiations and disputes, learning the difference between the legal import-export operations and the more complicated territorial management that kept their family powerful and protected. Finally, security training, where she learned to recognize threats, identify escape routes, and defend herself well enough to buy time for help to arrive. It was like learning a new language or adapting to a foreign culture, everything familiar, but with different rules, different expectations, different consequences for mistakes. Elena discovered that she was good at it, the attention to detail and quick decision in making that made her an excellent nurse, translated well to navigating family politics and understanding the subtle dynamics of power and respect that govern Dante's world. She also discovered that despite the obvious dangers and legal complications, she felt more herself in this world than she had in her previous life. Dante's family valued loyalty, intelligence, and competence, traits Elena had in abundance, but which hadn't always been appreciated in her previous relationships. They also valued directness and honesty. Once trust was established, which made communication easier than the careful political correctness she was used to in hospital ADM. Illustration 6 months after the break-in at her apartment, Elena moved into Dante's penthouse, officially as his girlfriend, but practically as his partner in both personal and business matters. She kept her job at the hospital partly because she loved the work and partly because it provided perfect cover for their family's activities. No one suspected a trauma nurse of being involved in organized crime, and Elena's medical skills proved useful for treating injuries that couldn't be reported to authorities. The transition wasn't seamless. Elena had to learn new social skills, navigate complex family relationships, and adjust to a level of luxury and security she'd never experienced. She also had to reconcile her personal ethics with the reality of being part of an organization that used violence and intimidation to maintain power, but she discovered that the moral ambiguity was less troubling than she'd expected. Dante's family operated by strict codes of honor and loyalty. They protected their people and their community. They punished genuine wrongdoing, and they avoided unnecessary violence whenever possible. It wasn't the same as working within legal systems, but it wasn't arbitrary cruelty either. It was a different kind of justice administered by people who cared deeply about the consequences. of their decisions. The relationship itself deepened in ways Elena hadn't expected. Now that Dante no longer had to hide his work from her, their communication became more honest, more intimate. They could discuss the stresses and challenges of his responsibilities, and Elena could offer support and advice that actually helped rather than just providing distraction from problems she wasn't allowed to know about. They also discovered that they worked well together. Elena's medical training and analytical thinking complemented Dante's strategic planning and leadership skills when family business required careful negotiation or complex problem solving. They made an effective team. Dante's uncle noticed and began including Elena in discussions about long-term planning and family strategy. 6 months later, when Dante's uncle decided to retire early and transition full control to the next generation, Elena found herself being consulted about major family decisions and asked to take on responsibilities that went well beyond girlfriend duties. She was becoming part of the family's leadership structure, not just as Dante's partner, but as someone whose judgment and skills were valued in their own right. A year after their first dinner together, Dante proposed, not with a surprise romantic gesture, but with a serious conversation about their future and what marriage would mean in terms of legal and practical commitment. Elena said yes, not because she was swept away by romance, but because she'd found someone who valued her intelligence, treated her as an equal, and loved her enough to trust her with the truth about his life, even when that truth was dangerous. The wedding was a major family event, bringing together relatives and business associates from across the country. It was also Elena's formal introduction to the broader organized crime community as Dante's wife and partner rather than just his girlfriend. The ceremony itself was traditional. The reception was elaborate, and Elena found herself enjoying the celebration more than she'd expected, surrounded by people who had become genuinely important to her despite the unconventional circumstances that had brought them together. 2 years after confronting a stranger at her apartment door, Elena Romano was planning the expansion of their family's legitimate business operations, working part-time as a private nurse for family members and associates, and serving as an unofficial advisor to Dante on matters requiring her particular expertise. She was also 3 months pregnant with their first child, a development that made both families ridiculously happy and prompted extensive discussions about security measures and succession planning. She had never planned to fall in love with someone involved in organized crime, had never imagined herself navigating family politics that involved territorial disputes and enforcement actions, had never expected to find fulfillment in a life that required constant awareness of legal and physical risks. But looking back, Elena realized that everything that had seemed like obstacles or complications had actually been opportunities to discover what she was capable of handling and what kind of life would make her truly happy. The apartment situation that had initially seemed like a disaster had led her to someone who appreciated her strength and intelligence. The danger and moral ambiguity that should have driven her away had helped her discover that she was braver and more adaptable than she'd known. The need for honesty and trust in a relationship where secrets could be fatal had created a level of intimacy and partnership she'd never experienced before. 5 years later, when their daughter Isabella started asking questions about Daddy's work, Elena was able to explain family business in terms that emphasized loyalty, protection, and responsibility rather than violence and criminality. By then, their legitimate operations had expanded significantly, and the illegal activities had become more focused on managing relationships between families rather than territorial enforcement. Dante had successfully transitioned the family toward a model that maintained their power and influence while reducing their exposure to legal consequences and physical risks. It wasn't a complete transformation. Organized crime didn't work that way, but it was progress toward a version of family business that would be safer and more sustainable for the next generation. Elena had played a significant role in that transition. Her outsider perspective and professional background had helped identify opportunities and strategies that longtime family members might have missed. Her influence had also helped moderate some of the more aggressive tendencies in family culture, encouraging negotiation over confrontation whenever possible. 10 years later, when Isabella brought her own boyfriend home to meet her parents, Elena and Dante found themselves in the position of evaluating whether a new person could handle the realities of their family while protecting the privacy and security that kept everyone safe. Isabella's boyfriend, Michael, was a law student, which created interesting dynamics. but he was also clearly devoted to Sabella and willing to learn the complex social rules that governed their world. Elena remembered being in his position, trying to understand a culture that was simultaneously welcoming and intimidating, where loyalty was paramount and mistakes could have serious consequences. She also remembered how much Dante's patience and honesty had meant during her own adjustment period, watching Dante mentor Michael with the same care he'd shown her. Elena was reminded of how much their relationship had been built on mutual respect and genuine partnership rather than just attraction or convenience. 20 years later, when Isabella announced her engagement to Michael, who had become a successful lawyer specializing in helping families navigate complex business and legal challenges, Elena realized that they had successfully created the kind of legacy Dante's uncle had envisioned. When he'd first welcomed her into the family, they had maintained family power and influence. While building legitimate business operations, they had raised children who understood both the privileges and responsibilities of their position. They had created relationships based on trust and mutual support rather than fear and intimidation. Most importantly, they had proven that love and partnership could flourish even in complicated circumstances if both people were willing to be honest about who they were and what they needed from each other. 25 years after Elena had confronted a stranger at her apartment door, she and Dante were established leaders in both legitimate business and their extended family community. Their children were building their own lives with partners who understood and accepted the complexities of being part of their world. Their marriage had survived the challenges of organized crime, politics, family business stresses, and the normal difficulties of building a life with another person. Elena had never regretted her decision to stay, to accept Dante's world, and to build a partnership based on complete honesty, even when that honesty was difficult. The life she'd built was nothing like what she'd planned, but it was everything she'd never known she wanted. Sitting in their living room, watching Isabella and Michael plan their wedding, Elena reflected on the strange series of events that had led to this moment. If her landlord hadn't sold the building, if Dante hadn't needed an apartment, if she'd made different choices about trust and risk and love, her life would have been completely different, safer, perhaps more conventional, certainly, but also much less interesting and much less fulfilling. Sometimes the best love stories start with the strangest beginnings, Elena thought, and sometimes the person who ruins your life in the beginning ends up being the person who makes it complete. She looked at Dante, reading wedding planning magazines with the same serious attention he'd once devoted to territorial negotiations, and smiled. He'd been worth every risk, every complicated choice, every moment of uncertainty she'd experienced in choosing to build a life with him, and she'd choose him again every single time, because the love they'd built together was worth protecting, worth fighting for, and worth celebrating, even if it had begun in the most unlikely way imaginable, with a stranger at her door who turned out to be exactly the person she'd been waiting for without knowing it.